This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/into the portal. Hey everyone, before we get started, we just wanted to give a special shout out to our newest Patreon supporters.
Thanks, Aaron and Molly. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to having you in our exclusive Patreon community.
Most of us will go through life without seeing monsters, without being tormented by something that cannot be explained. Pixies, imps, or perhaps even gremlins. To some, the word gremlin would at one time onset an unsettled feeling far beyond the thrills of a 1980s Hollywood film. In the 1940s, British RAF pilots began to experience something on a great scale that had only been scarcely reported in previous decades. Their aircraft were being attacked, harassed, and sabotaged by swarms of unknown entities, later dubbed the Gremlins. Many flyers claimed to have witnessed the creatures and spoke candidly amongst their fellow pilots. Others held on to their stories for many years. The following is an experience from a pilot known as LW. (1941). It was a combat mission. I was a B-17 pilot. We were young. We were all young. I was 22 years old, and I was the flight commander at the time. That was the average age for officers. The gunners were usually around 18 years old. But we were sharp. We were very sharp. We were clean kids. And I'll never forget what I saw that day.
Ground control, this is Sierra Delta 226. I have a situation here. There's something under my wings. Oh my God, they're everywhere.
I hadn't been flying for long yet that afternoon. I was very aware of my surroundings. These things were real. They were real, all right, and as I went higher, I noticed an unusual sound coming from the engine.
Come in, ground control. I have no bearing. My instruments are all wrong. Please respond. Over.
I look at my right and I see an entity staring me right in the face. And then I look at the aircraft's nose and there's another one hanging there. Dancing lizards. This was just one of many incidents that occurred in the skies involving such creatures. The question is, do they really exist? Join us on Into the Portal as we investigate a strange historical mystery. The Gremlins.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
And we're back.
Amber's classic. Ooh. We are indeed. We're back again. These weeks just keep flying by. It's honestly, crazy. Yeah. It's like all of a sudden we're at Saturday and we're recording again. Mm-hmm. It's wild.
It's crazy.
So much fun, though. And This week's episode is a little different, I like to think. I think it's going to catch some people off guard, maybe, kind of. It's pretty cool. It's different.
Yeah, and it's been a long time coming, because I first heard about this probably probably at least 3 months ago.
And at least, yeah.
Yeah, it was on the list. It kept getting pushed back, but now
it's here. But before we get right into it, we wanted to go over a couple other things.
Yeah, we got some sweet new reviews.
Yes, we did.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
We appreciate it. There was some on the, one on the American iTunes, which I'll read out here. Cool. It was from Border Love, and he gave it a have to listen with 5 stars. Thank you so much, bud. He says here, these podcasters know how to tell a story that totally engulfs you. If you love these kind of stories, this is definitely a podcast for you. I love the episode about Braxton County.
Hey,
yeah,
nice.
That one's been really popular.
People love it.
Yeah, we got great feedback on it.
Well, it's always nice to team up with Zenger from Zeng This.
Yeah, I'm really excited. We got this upcoming thing with him on his show. He's planning on having us as guests for his Harry Potter series.
Yeah, that's going to be fun. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, this will be coming up.
We do have another one here too. So this is actually our only Australian iTunes review, and which makes us really happy because that's wonderful. So this is from Duty Dutrom, 5 stars. I've never listened to a podcast like this before. Normally movie reviews and pop culture stuff, but I'm 100% on board. Great show, amazing for new listeners. Now added to the weekly roster. Give it a check. So that's awesome. Thank you so much, Duty. We really appreciate it, man. Yeah. And all the reviews and feedback that we get.
Totally.
I think there was one more, right? We wanted to.
Yeah. Well, we got some feedback from from one of our Patreon supporters, the Cronkite. Hey man, what's up? Oh, I was so stoked to see your response to that letter we sent out to you. I apologize again for how terrible my penmanship is, because
it's way better than mine, so don't feel too bad. Like, Amber wrote the handwritten letter, and I just signed it at the bottom, because if I wrote it, it would be completely illegible, so.
It was my first take, too. I didn't redo it.
But it was really cool to kind of get the response just to see how, like, happy he was to get those stickers, and just, you know, we're so stoked to have the support, and then he mentioned that his kids love the show, too. Yeah. Which is awesome. Yeah,
that's really cool. And the stickers we gave him, it was the Into the Portal, the Ogopogo, all the cryptids in it. So I feel like the kids really like that too.
Definitely.
Hopefully. But yeah, we do want to get some of our black and white logo done up as well.
We're doing that very, very soon, for sure. That is in the works.
Definitely.
And then I think just one more little update thing before we get started. So we wanted to just say that we wanted to apologize because we mentioned last week that we were going to have one of our bonus mini episodes up, and it's just taking slightly longer. So but we're going to have that up as soon as possible.
We had to dig it out of the treasure chest of our
garage band.
I kind of I'm still piecing it together. So it'll be up.
So it's going to be up. So you can go check that out real soon.
Yeah, that was a really fun one. I had a heck of a time with the intro, but it was definitely came out as one of my best ones, I think. With all the sound effects, those trumpets. Anyways,
it's super
not
fun.
Gonna give it all away.
No, it's super, super fun. So go check that out. King John's Crown Jewels. It's coming at you. All right. Well,
let's get into it.
I say let's get into it. We are talking about.
I say.
We are talking about the Gremlins.
And not the 1980s film.
No. So of course that's what comes to mind for pretty much everybody when someone says Gremlins, right? Like, and I honestly can't even remember. Like, I definitely watched that movie when I was younger, but I can't really remember it.
I only remember the very first scene when they're down in Chinatown in that creepy little shop,
right?
And there's the whole transaction occurs.
Yeah.
But honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, because we looked into, like, obviously we were looking at tons of photos of these things, and a lot of it was from that movie, and they kind of look like evil Yodas.
Yep.
Don't they?
Yep, they
like
definitely do.
A little bit nastier looking.
Furrier looking at the beginning anyway, and then they turn into skin.
I don't even know. Yeah, it's almost like a reptilian, like, alien. What was it called in Chinese?
The Magawi.
The Magawi, right.
Yeah.
They do make that reference in the movie.
Yeah, so in the movie Gremlins, so it's like the guy, he buys a Magawi for his kid, and that's kind of one of the older origin stories for the Gremlins is like, this creature in Chinese mythology, the Magawi, which is basically like, exactly like they covered it in the movie, like, don't feed it after midnight, don't expose it to the sun, don't do the XYZ, otherwise it'll turn into something awful, and of course it does in the movie. So, but that's one of the origins of the, I love
how we said we're not going to talk about the movie, and now we're talking about the movie.
Yeah, well, you can't, we kind of had to touch on it at the beginning, right? Because that's, of course, what everyone's going to be thinking, but, that's not what we're getting into. So, the movie was inspired by real events, and even though it wasn't, like, directly from the events, but the characters were inspired from the events, and it all sort of started it really came to be in the 1940s, but we're going to talk about a few other things too, because there were references to these very real creatures attacking British RAF planes, both
and
American, started with RAF, but this, like I said, it really blossomed in the 40s, but there's references from earlier too. Right. So we're going to get into all of it. The term itself, gremlin, is kind of disputed. Some think it kind of comes from the Old English word grem or gream, which basically means to vex or to annoy, and that's kind of the gist of what these things were. Like, they weren't outright trying to kill anything from the stories that we'll give, but they definitely were annoying. So what were some of the characteristics?
So there was definitely a myriad of bad behaviors that gremlins were supposedly responsible for. And some of it's a little bit more nefarious than others, but things like sucking the gas out of tanks through hoses, jamming frequencies on radio systems, mucking up landing gear, or just landings in general.
Right.
Blowing dust and sand into fuel pipes or into sensitive equipment, cutting wires, tinkering with dials, jostling controls, slashing wings and tires, banging incessantly on the fuselage, breaking windows, and not to mention even just their presence, right? These things,
just
the visual is a distraction.
Totally.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's a ton of different things going on here. And yeah,
all of it is going to affect you while you're flying a fighter plane or a B-17 bomber or whatever aircraft you're using in the Second World War, which is already hard to fly, obviously.
Yeah.
Some of these are interesting because I feel like, and we'll get into it too, but like some of them are more kind of like specific than others. Like if a wire is cut, you know what I mean? Like that's really specific. You land, the wire's cut.
It's not as if it's like frayed or something.
Yeah,
like it's a little bit more deliberate, seemingly.
Exactly.
Like not just like it was neglect and now we're just going to blame it on the gremlins.
Exactly. Or sand, if you're not in an area where there would be sand.
Yeah.
So that comes up. So it's very interesting, right?
Wasn't there another substance that was found sometime? I thought you mentioned it it's not in the notes or anything, but it was something...
Trying to remember.
Was it like a goo? I know sand was one of them, and then there was like another one. Or maybe it was the opposite, where they were supposed to be exactly like where there's supposed to be fuel in the tank, and then there's just not.
Yeah.
So it's like
just replaced it with something else.
And no like sign of like damage, right? Like no hole in the fuel tank. It's just gone.
Bizarre.
So things that should be there aren't, and then things that shouldn't be there are.
Yeah.
And these things work in packs. They don't.
No, it's not just one thing.
It's like a horde.
Swarms and hordes of these things.
Yeah. And the range, the size definitely ranges, hey, with the some of them are like, they're about 2 inches tall. Some of them describe them as a couple feet.
Yeah, I think like it sort of averages out at around a foot tall. Like, yeah, some are larger, some are smaller, but kind of the average was like they're about a foot tall creatures, which is kind of what you would expect from something like this, right? Like gremlins, imps, leprechauns, those types of kind of mythical creatures. A foot seems
big to me.
I mean,
I'm imagining like a
Tinkerbell
size.
12 inches would be is it physical?
But could you imagine, 12 inches and there's a bunch of them? You know what I mean? So in that sense, that to me points to something that maybe isn't physical.
Potentially.
Because in some of these smaller aircraft, but anyway, that's just one theory. Obviously, like, are these things physical creatures? Are they? Do they manifest? Like,
right.
That's kind of.
Well, that's just it, and that comes up in the description. Some of them are more as if they're physical. Some are more as if they're metaphysical,
or like ghosts.
The descriptions definitely ghosts. That's another one too.
With glowing eyes and horns.
Yeah, glowing red eyes. That's a characteristic. Like the descriptions vary, but past findings have sort of linked them to. They have similarities to things like the chupacabra, which is a cryptid creature from Mexico, I guess, and Central America. Mexico's North America, but of Mexico and then further down in Central America, right? And which is basically a smaller version of kind of like a werewolf-like creature, but spiky back, red glowing eyes, kind of gaunt looking. So
really, I always thought chupacabra was more similar to like the Yahweh or the Bigfoot or.
No, they're actually quite smaller. So like they attack like livestock and stuff like that. It's like it's kind of a smaller version of the same sort of deal.
The chupacabra. That brings me back to X-Files.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, lots of similarities there. So like the large red glowing eyes, sharp claws, and the main one that was similar to the chupacabra is massive mouthful of teeth. Like just huge, sharp teeth that are very prominent.
Creepy.
That were, like you're standing on the front of a plane staring through at the pilot and with this big, huge, menacing grin of teeth.
Ugh.
The other interesting thing that I read was that there's actually some similarities to the creatures described at the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. Okay. If you're not familiar with that, I would highly recommend that you go listen to the Astonishing Legends series on that incident because it's really fascinating. Because it was sort of, we're not going to get into it, but it's sort of a weird in between a cryptid creature, alien incident. It's sort of bizarre. It sort of blends together into this.
Yeah.
Right? So it's basically these little goblin-like creatures attacking a house in Kelly Hopkinsville. Miniature.
Owl-sized.
Sternicle? Owl-sized? Yeah, so
This was in the 50s, right?
That was in the 50s, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
that was a classic encounter case, though.
Definitely.
Like, and yeah, that is actually an interesting
So it's
connection.
like these, so if they are connected, there's an instance on the ground later on after the 40s.
In that case, though, there was a craft, wasn't there? I feel like there was.
Yeah, I think there was too.
Like, and they had like seen it land in the field, and
trying to remember now.
From a distance. I think that's how it started, right? And the family was in the house.
I believe
Anyways,
so.
We're not going to go through the whole thing, but
right. The point is that the creatures themselves were very similar.
And the point I was trying to make was that that is one potential differentiation.
Yeah,
because
totally.
in all of these accounts that we're about to get into, there's no craft involved. It's them,
right.
Like, basically just showing up somehow. Either they're there the whole time, or they have, like, Superman abilities. It's like,
yeah, well, they almost just materialize out of the clouds.
Yeah.
It's like some of the pilots describe them as, like, living in the clouds. Mm-hmm. So
that's cool. Sky creatures.
Yeah, right?
Sky monsters.
Of course, you can already, all of you listening can already tell that I'm Andrew going to be getting into some sort of interdimensional theory at some point, because that's just, I can't not, right?
But you have to remember there is a skeptical perspective in this whole thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I came across this one description of the gremlin from the Ashgate Encyclopedia of Literary and Cinematic Monsters. It was an anthology. And this is the quote here. It says, variant descriptions of gremlins indicate that they may have green skin or be blue, have reptilian features, or be hairy, or some combination of both, with accoutrements varying from horns to gnarled teeth concealed within a diabolic smile. Regardless of the depiction, they mainly functioned as an alibi for the failed upkeep of highly mechanized combat airplanes put into military service by British and American forces alike. Gremlins, in practical history, seem to be scapegoats for human and mechanical error. End quote.
Right.
And so you can definitely see how a lot of these... Yeah, definitely there would be a large amount of cases that were the result of human or mechanical error or failed upkeep or something.
Yeah.
But I would argue not all of them. And there is a lot of pilots reporting this, which could be a result of something else. Could be substance-based. We'll get into that as one of the theories.
Definitely.
And obviously the other idea that these pilots were in confined spaces, in very,
high altitudes, cold
high
weather,
altitudes,
long
cold
time.
weather, by themselves, in isolation. So that could all be factors that would maybe enhance perceptions of things that maybe aren't there.
Totally.
That's a nice way of saying hallucination. But,
right. But then on the flip side, of course, you have pilots that have responded to some of this and basically take offense to it.
And there's physical evidence, too, involved in some of them as well. So it's not just in their heads.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Because, like, that, and again, like, we'll talk about this in the theory section, but it's like, it makes total sense if you've been in the air for a long time, or if you've been at a high altitude for a long time. But some of these instances have happened, like, shortly after takeoff. Like, you're not in the air for a long time.
Yeah.
And you start to see weird stuff. So, that all comes into play, right? Because it matters. It matters how long you've been in the air.
It does.
It matters how high up you are, how cold you are, how little you've eaten. All
what
this stuff.
other things might be in your prescribed diet for the military. And that is definitely something that might be a part of this. But at the same time, I have other counter arguments to that theory as well, but we're not really going to get into that at this particular moment.
I mean, the thing is right here when we're going to talk about some of the main characteristics. We've already mentioned them before, but like the thing that stands out to me with a lot of the accounts that we're going to give in a sec is that they look the same, these gremlins, right? So it's like, it's kind of going through the grapevine. Pilots are talking about this, and maybe there was some stories that had surfaced from earlier, like the 1920s and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there's just, the similarities are so, like, there's not much crossover. Like, there's a few kind of subtleties, like, oh, maybe it's green skin, maybe it's blue skin. But for the most part, it's very, very, like, people are seeing the same thing.
Yeah, not a lot of contradiction.
No, and I think that means something.
Yeah, that does... the consistency in the accounts, that definitely lends legitimacy to the overall phenomena, I would say. And for me, it was the interesting thing was that it wasn't just one. Yeah. It was the hive mentality of these creatures. Like they appear in swarms. Yeah. And again, I'm going to reference X-Files. Remember that one episode where they were in the woods and it was like loggers and they were doing like deep forest logging and they ended up releasing that swarm of like iridescent looking like almost like
tree people. They were like invisible like forest people.
No, not that one.
Oh, different one.
No, it was the one where it was the swarm, right? The iridescent looking like almost like little fireflies, and they came and they just like they made those weird like webs and just like I don't even know if they were like devouring people or just like mummifying them.
They were like mummifying them and digesting them in the cocoon or something.
Right. And that anyway, sorry, just hive mentality, that sort of thing really reminded me of that. Obviously, a lot of these cases that we're going to cover were not fatalities by any means, but maybe there were fatalities that were just never... Right? Exactly, right?
How would you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So, in general, they're nefarious, they're troublemakers, but not deadly, working in groups, miniature in size, almost have descriptions like similar to like fairies or sprites in some cultures, right? A similar troublemaker type function, and the idea that it's a half physical entity, half spirit, maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like,
yeah,
because it materializes out of nowhere, but then it physically does stuff.
Exactly. And another very, very interesting thing about the gremlin is that it is only found in accounts related to aircraft. You don't see the same things with boats. You don't see the same things with tanks, like with other like mechanical equipment used by the army or anything.
Right.
And that will play into one of my counter arguments for one of the theories. Again.
Yeah.
I'm just teasing all you guys. I'm sorry, but
that is fascinating, though, right? It was more or less.
It's air-based.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. At least for this stage of Gremlins, right? Like, obviously, like, if we go way back in history, like, we give the brief kind of, like, the origin is the Magawe. Mm-hmm. These things have existed well before, like, the machinery of the...
Is that really the same thing, though?
It's not the exact same, but it's just people have reported creatures like this, though, right? That they in Greek mythology too. I'm forgetting the name.
But is there that precedent where it's like don't feed them after midnight, or is that
I think that's specific to the Magawe.
Okay.
But the overarching kind of theme of it is similar cross culturally, where it's basically like these things aren't going to kill you necessarily, but they're just these. Don't mess with them because they'll mess with you. Yeah. And even if you don't mess with them, they're probably going to mess with you.
Interesting.
It's
but again, does function as a scapegoat in a lot of cases
very
too,
much so.
I would imagine.
Very much so. Definitely. But then it's like the question of why wouldn't she obviously summer U-boats needed scapegoats too. Not that she would like, right? Other missions would need scapegoats too, potentially. Yeah. Nobody came up with a different character to scapegoat for other shortcomings or whatever, right?
So that does again lend some legitimacy to this.
Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I just think it's interesting.
To me it does, because if this simply was just that, right, like some sort of way to sort of garner morality and unity with the troops, but the thing is, like, the classic use of that would be the enemy.
Yeah, why would you need to make it? Yeah, exactly.
I guess you can't necessarily blame a loose screw on the Germans, but well, you know what I mean. Maybe that wouldn't really work, but anyways.
We're
yeah. So anyways, main characteristics, we've kind of covered that. And most of these occurrences are with single pilots.
Right.
So not a lot of witnesses around.
Most of them.
Not all.
I think we need to start getting into some of these accounts.
Yeah. And the one I'm really excited to dive into is probably the most famous, I would say. Yeah. And that came in 1927 with Charles Lindbergh, his solo flight over the Atlantic.
Right.
So this is fascinating to me because he is not a crackpot kind of a guy by any means. And he is reported to have experienced these gremlins on this flight, which he later wrote about in his memoir, The Spirit of St. Louis, which he published in 1953.
Okay.
So apparently this was several hours into the flight. He was about halfway when he became aware of these little creatures on the outside of his plane. On the outside of his plane.
Interesting.
And that's actually, to me, I'm not sure how accurate that is, because I came across other accounts that said
it was inside.
Something different. Yeah, where it was inside.
Right.
But nevertheless, whether it was inside, outside, he says, the way he describes is that he became aware of them and that they telepathically communicated with him.
Interesting.
So this is a quote. This is a quote
weird.
from just this random website, didyouknowfacts.com. This is, quote, several hours into his record-breaking flight from New York to Paris in 1927, Lindbergh claimed that transparent-like creatures that looked grim and menacing, these are quotes from his memoir, Transparent-like Creatures That Look Grim and Menacing, joined him on his plane. Unlike several of the other accounts, he wasn't frightened by them. It says here, this is from a different blog called theflightblog.com. It says, these spirits, as he called them, reassured him that he was going to be all right and helped with navigation. So that's weird to me. And that maybe points to something a little bit different, but in a lot of the accounts, like, it does sound very similar to the Gremlin.
Yeah.
And this is actually a direct quote from The Spirit of St. Louis, written by Lindbergh himself.
Okay.
So he says here, I've never believed in apparitions, but how can I explain the forms I carried with me through so many hours of this day? The voices that spoke with such authority and clearness that told... ... That was the end of the quote. It was a Google preview it was like a non-preview Google preview, and it only gave me that snippet. It was
Crazy.
page 467. If anyone has a copy of The Spirit of St. Louis, I would really like to look into that, but I didn't have time to order it and then read it before this episode, so boo, it sucks. But there was another quote from him. It was a direct quote again from his Spirit of St. Louis memoir.
Okay.
This is a bit of a long one, but it is very interesting,
Yeah.
so I'm just going to read it out.
Go for it.
Well, actually, sorry. I'm just reading here. The last part of the quote is from Lindbergh, but the first part is actually from another website. I can't remember the name of the website off the top of my head.
That's
but anyways,
okay. Go for it.
Yeah, so we're going to read this out. The mystical experience happened in 1927 during the 33-plus hour flight over the Atlantic. During the long and lonely flight, Lindbergh experienced an altered state of consciousness. In this state, he became aware of 3 parts of himself. The plane was filled with ghostly beings which were transparent and weightless. Lindbergh describes seeing with one great eye the beings around him without having to turn around. The beings consoled and reassured him in friendly human voices. As things progressed, Lindbergh lost sense of his physical body, something reported in many mystical experiences. He recognized that although he was still attached to life, the beings were not. Furthermore, the famous transatlantic pilot seemed to experience a shift in his view of death. Death no longer seemed the final end it used to be, but rather the entrance to a new and free existence which includes all space, all time. End quote. So that last part there, that death no longer seems the final end, that was from him.
Yeah.
And this was a what do you call it when you're doing an annotation? Yeah, so they were annotating the text and just yeah. So that was very interesting. It was like definitely a transcendental experience for him, which is kind of, to me, it almost reminds me of like what some people describe after being in a state of sensory deprivation for an extended period of time, where they just become, it's almost as if he crossed over into like a different dimension or something, hey, where he's like able to see things that maybe we're not able to see regularly.
Yeah, it's almost like, it kind of reminds me of when we were this is totally unrelated, but like we were watching a crash course history video and talking about the Buddha and like how like the original Buddha starved himself sitting under a tree.
Right.
You become aware of other stuff.
Yeah.
So a 33-hour flight, at that altitude, freezing cold, all this kind of stuff. Amelia Earhart didn't report seeing similar things, and she did a solo flight across the Atlantic that took a little bit less time, I think, just by a few hours or something, but, I mean, ridiculously long flight. Mm-hmm. Not to say that everybody flying solo in those conditions is going to have the same experience necessarily, but that is just a strange story.
Isn't it? And obviously, like, these things were with him for several hours. It wasn't as if, like, they were just there and then gone.
Right.
And it was it sounded very gradual or natural, the transition for him into that state of consciousness. But again, this definitely has some inconsistencies as far as like being related to the Gremlins, because of the fact that they weren't really tinkering with anything. If anything, they were just helping him through it. So This could be more of just like a spiritual experience.
That's what it sounds like. It's definitely unique compared to the other instances.
It is, but it's one of those ones that comes up right away.
Yep.
When you look at Gremlins, Lindbergh is definitely associated with that. And
the other main point about this is, of course, this came before the 30s.
Yes.
So this was post Great War, before the Second World War, which is where this would really come into play. And some people argue that the origins are entirely from the 40s. They're entirely from RAF pilots making up stories. That's what some of the accounts we've come across, which is quite frankly just not true, because there's this instance in 27. We also have pilots from the First World War who were, in their teens in the First World War. And I mean, planes didn't come into as much, they weren't as significant in the First World War as they were in the Second. Obviously, it was more reconnaissance, things like that.
Yeah.
But the RAF was still a thing.
And there was shorter flights. Too.
Shorter flights, right? But somebody who is a 17-year-old pilot in the Great War, some of them, enlisted in service in the Second World War too, right? They were still young enough to fly or fight or whatever. And there's some accounts from that. So we're moving on from Lindbergh now. So, and I'm not going to jump right to the Second World War because, here I am. So I got a 1918 account. So one of the first mentions of the creatures can be traced back as to an early reference to them in the early 1900s.
Okay.
And then later on during the First World War, so in 1918. So this was a quote that was actually published later in a British newspaper called The Spectator. So this was an article from 1943, but it's referencing a pilot who flew in 1918 in the RAF. So it goes like this. I was in the old RAF service in 1917 and the newly constituted Royal Air Force in 1918, which first appeared to have detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious spirits whose purpose sprites, whose whole purpose in life was to disconcert pupil pilot and experienced pilot alike, and to bring about as many possible of the inexplicable mishaps which in those days as now troubles the airman's life. So that was the quote from the newspaper. Most of the reports later on in the 1940s came from the Battle of Britain, apparently. But this guy, it's actually nameless, but it was a pilot in 1918 that claimed that their unit was swarmed by a horde of gremlins, basically. Not a ton of other, they weren't brought down by it. It was just a sighting. It was just don't. So
the newly constituted Royal Air Force, hey? That's, okay, so we get a precedent in 1918, so that's really the first story, and so that would precede Lindbergh, and then we get Lindbergh in 1927.
Right.
So that pokes holes in a few theories that I've seen come across during research, so that's very interesting to me.
Totally. This actually continues on here. Do you want me to read the rest? Because it's kind of interesting. So it's so such were the Gremlins and all ranks of flying and maintenance personnel of the RAF who had as much flying experience during the past 25 years of their malicious pranks, for that they exist. Of course they exist. Unquestionable that they do. And we know much about their life and habits, although the outside world is still largely ignorant of their activities. End quote.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So definitely being written about as if it's very real, right? Yeah.
That's I like that because, well, again, I always toy with this idea where I was like, did it come about first as just a nice, convenient way to sort of blame mishaps, blame mistakes, blame things, but then evolved into something much more real? Or was it the other way around, right? Where it was very real and inexplicable and it was a mystery, and then people started to capitalize on it a little bit.
That's what I lean towards.
Exactly. What was first, chicken or egg here, man? Yeah. I don't know.
Chicken and egg situation, man.
Which came first, chicken or the egg? Aliens.
Good answer.
I don't know where that was, some dumb meme I saw the other day.
Oh, man.
But yeah, like we were saying before, it wasn't just the British. This came from all sides. Well, mostly Allied sides. There was, we didn't really come across any from the German
That's just
side.
it. We tried to find some. So we most of the articles that we looked into and the resources we found said that both sides experienced it, that it wasn't just the Allied forces, although there was mainly RAF and then later on American pilots.
That would be interesting if we have any German listeners or people with German family members that were in. Well, this is a reach, but if anyone, from that side of the world has any stories about Gremlins or anything similar in concept to what was being experienced on the Allied side during this time, that would be really interesting. Because honestly, we didn't come across any of that, but there was the one article. In what magazine was it again?
It was Life magazine. So that was 1942 that
and
this
that's
article
an American
came out.
publication.
Yeah.
And they were saying what?
They were basically saying that there were no indications that the Germans had been that the Axis powers had been experiencing. Exactly. How would you know?
It's 1942.
Yeah.
They're the enemy.
They're not going to tell you.
Exactly.
Oh, hey guys, just so you know, we're not experiencing Gremlins.
Because they had those kamikaze bombers.
That's actually
what if they
really
weren't actually kamikaze bombers, but the Gremlins guys?
Honestly, though, that is really interesting. And like, I tried to find some German sources. I even looked on like German websites, like .de or whatever, and and I copy pasted a few things where I saw like Gremlin, but it was just for the movie. Like, it was just hard to find anything that was like referencing stories.
We don't speak German.
No, so we have a few friends that do, so maybe we can get them to take a look at some stuff. But anybody else there that's listening, if you speak German or if you're familiar with this at all, please let us know if there's any accounts on that side, because we'll definitely do a little bonus if there is, because that's something to be followed up on for sure.
Yep.
But for the most part, though, we're just going to go with that both sides were experiencing this, because that's what the majority of the articles we've looked at say. And it makes sense. I mean, it's not as if the Germans would be weaponizing these strange creatures that materialize in the sky just to attack Allied forces.
Ooh, you know what this reminds me of now? It reminds me of that new technology that allows people to manipulate weather systems and create clouds and storm systems in other areas, and then suck all the moisture and all the cloud systems away from others using various pressures.
Crazy.
But what if these things are like basically that, where it's like these things can be manifested? This almost reminds me of like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Was it in the new one where he has like the thing where he actually like he like miniaturizes and like puts them in the TV? Anyway, oh my god,
I was in both of them. Both the original had that too.
Okay,
I think.
Okay.
Yeah, now we're talking about Charlie and the Chocolate.
Oh lord. All right, back on track here. What are we at? We're at 1939, aren't we?
I believe so.
1939.
Okay, so this one, this one's strange. So.
This was the really freaky one.
Yeah, and there's debate whether or not this is actually linked to Gremlins or if it's a UFO incident or what have you.
Ultra-terrestrial.
This is the 1939 Berlitz incident. So in 1939, there was a USAF air incident that appears in a book written by Charlie Berlitz titled The World of Strange Phenomena, and it came out in 1988. But basically, the story goes that it was a transport plane, I believe, so it wasn't like a solo flyer. There was multiple crewmen on board. I think it was a crew of 12. And so a military transport plane. It was late in the summer of 1939, and the incident is just completely shrouded in mystery and secrecy. All they know is that this plane left the Marine Naval Air Station in San Diego around 3:30 p.m. one afternoon. It was a 13-man crew. They were making a routine flight to Honolulu. 3 hours later, over the Pacific, they started to experience some difficulties. We don't know exactly what those difficulties were. Frantic distress calls started to come in, but they were basically like the ground control couldn't really make heads or tails of it. It was just frantic, panic, distress calls that something was happening, but it was broken up. It wasn't clear. Then the signal died. A little later, the plane they aborted their flight to Honolulu and turned around and limped back to base and made an emergency landing. When the ground crew members rushed to the aircraft and boarded it, they were essentially, this is a quote from the book, they were horrified to see 12 of the 13 men dead. The only survivor was the co-pilot, who, although badly injured, had stayed alive long enough to bring the plane back. Just a few minutes later, after they had boarded the craft, the co-pilot himself died as well. All of the bodies, including the co-pilot, had large gaping wounds that were completely inexplicable. Even stranger, the pilot and co-pilot had both emptied their Colt 45 pistols at something, but not at the crew, the rest of the crew.
There wasn't any bullet holes in the plane itself, like the fuselage or like
you know what? That's a detail. They didn't give that detail. All they said was that they found the empty shells were lying on the floor of the cockpit. I'm assuming that if you're emptying 2 Colt 45 pistols and they are putting holes in the aircraft, then maybe that might cause more problems in limping back to base. You know what I mean?
Well, and there was no bullets found.
Just the shells. So... Which is very strange, right? The empty shells were found lying on the floor of the cockpit with a foul, sulfurous odor that pervaded the interior of the aircraft.
Weird.
Very strange. The exterior of the airplane was also badly damaged, as though it had been struck by missiles. So that kind of connects to Gremlins, who like they bang on the fuselage, they attach themselves under the wing and like do stuff on the outside of the aircraft. So that was maybe a connection. It continues on to say the personnel who boarded the craft also came down with odd skin infections. Strict security measures were quickly put into effect, and the emergency ground crew was ordered to leave the plane. The job of removing the bodies and investigating the incident was left to 3 different medical officers, and it was basically hushed up. It didn't come to light for 15 years until an investigator named Robert Gardner learned of it and basically looked into it. It's a mystery to this day.
What? So what, he didn't come up with anything?
It's almost like it reminds me of Dyatlov Pass.
I was going to say, this is like a Dyatlov crossed with Braxton County.
It's Dyatlov Pass on an airplane is basically what it is.
Wow, we should do an episode on this.
Now...
As we're doing an episode
it does deserve its own episode.
It really does.
The reason that we wanted to include this for the Gremlins episode is just because, of course, the timing, 1939. This is a USAF plane, not an RAF plane.
Okay.
Which is interesting because it just shows that both, 2 separate Allied forces were experiencing something bizarre in the air. The co-pilot that was alive, even for a short time, of course, didn't have enough time to tell anybody what happened.
Yeah.
He didn't tell anybody what he saw. They couldn't make anything out of the radio. But the damage on the outside of the aircraft is, to me, one of the only things that really speaks to Gremlins.
Well, and if they...
Because that's violent. That's a very violent incident.
And if they emptied their... how would something get into the plane, right?
What are you shooting at inside a plane?
Exactly.
Bizarre.
I'm really confused now. I wish we had pictures of what this plane looked like. We should do more digging. I'd really like to...
I think we'll probably do its own episode, maybe for a Patreon episode or something.
Yeah, let's do that.
But, yeah, something happened up there that the pilots ended up firing at, and whatever it was. I mean, of course, none of these other Gremlin incidents have large gaping wounds and sulfurous odors. So that's kind of unique. But clearly there was something up there that did something.
That is so weird. And the fact that they were so badly damaged, like the men themselves, large gaping wounds. What the heck was this? Sort of Sasquatch that just manifested inside the plane?
Third X-Files reference of the episode. This reminds me of the X-Files episode with the where they get stuck on that ship. That ghost ship, and they all have these lesions, and there's something strange going on the ship. It's this isolated, radioactive, whatever. They must have flown through a pocket of something bizarre. Maybe even the same place that the Gremlins are coming from. I don't know.
Found right? the mother lode, the home base.
They flew through a real high density of Gremlins, if that's what happened, because we're coming into a high pressure Gremlin system.
Do you imagine you just stumble across that? Whoopsies.
Yeah.
Wow, that is, that's pretty brutal, though. That's definitely downplays the sort of whimsical nature
a little bit
of the episode,
because this was a serious incident. It was investigated right at the time, and then later on by a researcher named Jerome Clark, who ended up writing a book on it. But he was legit. He was an American airman, and he was sort of best known for being chairman from 1941 to 1956 of the National Advisory Committee for U.S. Aeronautics. So he was legit, and he was investigating this almost of his own accord because it was just swept under the rug.
That's insane. Insane in the membrane.
So that was, just as the Second World War was getting started. But then we have another account during the war.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was in, the early 40s, 1942. And it was an account by this guy named Hubert Griffith. And it was very interesting because he, again, it was a little bit more nonchalant. Like, he was very straight up with it, with his account. And just, it's...
Yeah, like
it's baffling.
It is.
That's why I'm struggling with that.
Yeah.
What am I trying to say here? But okay, so this is a quote from his journal on his initial discovery of the Gremlins. Quote: "It is extraordinary to me to think that I had lived so long in the world without realizing the existence of a whole section of its inhabitants, the Gremlins. I am no longer operational aircrew, but I did 300 hours war flying in the last war, and have never heard the creatures mentioned. I was with a coastal command squadron for the first 6 months of the present war, then in France on an odd sort of racket. Wonder what that was about. And then in various RAF training sessions for almost a year on end. Still, I had never heard a hint of that strange word or of those strange little people. Little people, eh? Quite by chance, I found myself in northern Russia on an RAF fighter wing. Gremlins suddenly became an accepted fact of life. They were discussed quite freely on every hand. Their merits and demerits were argued about, just as if they were actual people sent to try us." End quote. So yeah, he makes several points during this. So he had never came across the creatures during World War I, and then even in World War II, he was in quite a number of units and never came across this.
Yeah.
So it wasn't everywhere. So
interesting.
Seemingly. And I honestly had a thought. I was like, hey, well, maybe his arrival at this unit, maybe this particular, I don't know where this idea originated from. Maybe it originated, again, with the squadron and just sort of spread as soldiers went to different areas and all that type of thing. You know how folklore spreads.
Yeah.
One person tells another person and so on and so forth.
Right.
But it's very interesting, like how he says they were discussed quite freely and they were just accepted. And it was just something to look out for. And we came across quite a number of wartime posters that alluded to the influence of the Gremlins, say in different areas, like, like the Gremlins, they'll look where you're stepping, because Gremlins will, they'll put oil slicks down or something.
Yeah.
Or watch out for the Gremlins because they're tinkering with your plane when you least expect it and all this stuff. So they're causing physical things to happen, maybe. I don't know. But he goes on, actually, to say that he had this, when he first came across this concept, he described his conversation about these Gremlins. And this was in officers' quarters in his unit at the Kremlin.
Okay.
So he says here, one of the pilots said, "Oh, they get out of the clouds and run up your wingtip, the wrong wingtip." The other added, "If you're taxiing, they run down the nose of the machine and tip you up, and you prang a prop, if nothing worse." You prang a prop, eh? I don't even know what that means. That was about as far as I got that night. A new subject was opened for me. The they was significant. They run out of the clouds. They tip you up on your nose, etc. Obviously, they were a sort of collective unity. They operated in droves or swarms. Was it hundreds of them, or at least scores, that ran out of clouds or in landing, upset the balance of the aircraft? One imagined them about the size of mice, or at the biggest, a procession of rats led by the Pied Piper of Hamelin. End quote. So that's interesting. He doesn't disclude the fact that they could be a scapegoat for human error.
Right. It's kind of leaving it open.
He definitely does, but he's definitely what's it called? Agnostic about the whole situation and how. But this is interesting too, because he doesn't actually go on to describe his personal encounters that I came across. It was always just in reference, in conversation, right?
Yeah, like just in conversation with his unit, basically, and others who had experienced it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, because I thought that we had come across something that basically, that he had, in fact, experienced it himself.
Had he?
The one thing that was interesting about this same source here, and of course we'll have all the sources for you guys to look at on the website, was that it basically said that the unit in the Russia unit was investigating this. It wasn't being experienced in all other RAF units, but they were legitimately concerned about it because pilots were reporting it. It wasn't just, guys joking around about something later on. They were genuinely concerned about like things happening with the aircraft.
Exactly.
So they would do extra checks on the ground. They would be, investigating whether or not there was like foreign objects in parts of the plane that weren't supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unless these RAF pilots were sabotaging their own planes to prop up their stories about gremlins, a lot of these things that were going wrong with the planes weren't typical wear and tear. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. This is interesting too, actually. Sorry, I'm just back to the original source where he got this information.
Okay.
He says here, this is a continuation of a quote from the journal. The next night, I heard from Mickey Rook in casual conversation in the mess about a new type of gremlin, the spandule, or the ice gremlin. This quote. He takes at 10,000 feet. Gremlins proper only operate lower down. What?
Right, interesting. So it's like different
again, like they're
breeds of
talking
gremlin.
about the merits and demerits. So they're talking about the different qualities of these things. Like that is very interesting to me. And he even goes on to say, their habits are a matter of day-to-day discussion. There has grown up a mass of gremlin lore and even gremlin literature. The RAF, always by far the most inventive of the services, seems to have taken the gremlin, if not to its heart, at least to its inner consciousness.
Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. And then he points again to this guy, Mickey Rook, and says that they're not always malevolent. They can be playful. They can have a sense of humor, even if it is distorted or, nefarious to a certain extent. So, yeah, but he never goes across... he never actually comes and says that he had his own experience. He's always just referencing different areas. Yeah. This is actually a really cool source. So yeah, this will be available in our references on our resource page on the website. So make sure you go check it out.
Yeah.
And I'm really stoked on how our website's looking right now.
Oh, it looks awesome.
Doesn't it look cool? It's got like this weird, like nebulous blue background. And it's like, I honestly just could stare at it all day. I want it to be my new desktop background, actually. That'd be really cool.
Oh, that'd be sweet.
Yeah. Can I do that? I don't think I
Probably.
can. I wonder. But, so that was the account from Hubert Griffith.
Hubert Griffith.
Hubie!
Yeah.
Get on you, buddy. Thanks for that.
And it's, like you said already, like it's interesting because it's like an agnostic kind of approach to it.
It's more just a research or kind of a...
Yeah. No, it is. No, right.
It's really poor wording.
No, it is, though. It's like, like he was just kind of asking around about it and he was trying to make heads or tails of it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I feel like it reads that the people he was talking to in his group were genuine about what they were experiencing. Yeah. That's definitely the vibe.
What it kind of reminds me of? It kind of reminds me of like stats for like different like Pokemon or something, or you know what I mean? Like, because there's differentiations within the concept of a gremlin. Right. Like that's cool. The idea that one can operate over 10,000 feet, but others can't. What? Yeah. What? Yeah. The ice gremlin, and then the fact that they refer to it as just a singular, not a plural. In that particular instance?
So it's like there's no hive at a certain altitude. There's no group. It's just a different species or something. Unless
it was just kind of like a dissociative, like this type of gremlin, he does this. This type of gremlin, he does that. Like, you know what I mean? So they're just kind of like referring to.
Well, there was a reference that I came across that basically said that, I don't know if this is true or not because it wasn't from a peer-reviewed source, but that the RAF was actually starting to change their flight manuals to actually teach people how to address different types of gremlins, how to deal with them in different situations. So, but it's like you could take that as literal. You could also take that as a sort of a memory tool for being like, hey, what do you do at this altitude? Yeah, right. Like, how do you make this maneuver?
It's almost, it's like dressing up the safety book. Like, that happened all the time, especially at the city. Hey, when we were working there, it's just like a way to engage with people and make it not as dry.
Right. So.
Safety is fun.
Safety.
Yay. Yeah.
We kind of have just one more account, I guess, that was alluded to in the, not alluded to, that was given in the introduction of the episode, but it was the 1941 LW B-17 bomber incident, which is kind of, it's sort of vague a little bit.
Yeah.
He didn't really even give his account of exactly how he like brought the plane down or like how it ended really, but he didn't speak about this until he was 92. So
Whoa.
He came out very, very late in his life with this story that basically he had experienced gremlins, that these little beings were capable of attaching themselves to the fuselage and withstanding high altitudes. And he, we gave the quote at the beginning, basically. He says, "Oh, they're real, all right." Mm-hmm. They climb inside the aircraft and hide in there, and they hook up under the wings. So
that's crazy. And he's 22 at that point of his life, so he waited 70 years.
I mean, obviously he was talking about it amongst his peers.
Right, okay.
But it wasn't, he never spoke to a reporter or spoke to anybody about it until way later. And I mean, it's like, that's one of those things. It's like, he didn't try to monetize it or anything. He didn't try to do anything. And people definitely did. There was actually a poem that was written in 1941. Mm-hmm. That was then, Walt Disney was inspired by the poem and basically ended up publishing a book that was called The Gremlins. It was a fairy tale about that, right? I can't remember who wrote it. Do you have the name of that?
Oh, no, it was the same guy that did...
Ronald Dahl.
Yeah.
An ex-RAF pilot who wrote The Gremlins. And then Walt Disney wanted to make a movie about it, but he couldn't really figure out how to make creatures who were destroying Allied aircraft lovable to the public, which kind of makes sense.
This Roald Dahl, like, he's come up with a lot of very quintessential, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that's another one. James and the Giant Peach, that's another one. What was it called? The Incredible Mr. Fox or something?
Oh, okay.
That was another one, I think.
So he's good at coming up with fairy tales, is what you're saying.
He is, yes. Yeah. James and the Giant Peach. I loved that one when I was young.
Yeah, it's a good story.
But yeah, no, that's interesting. So he definitely took it to a whole nother level. And then obviously that resulted in a movie eventually, which is kind of interesting.
It's funny too, like we've talked about the differences. Like we just said, there's the ice gremlin at 10,000 and other gremlins down below. There's a poem here that came out in 41 or 40. Did you come across this poem?
No.
I don't have to read the whole thing because it's kind of long, but there's just this one section that's really interesting. I'll kind of just read it from halfway. It says, "It's no good trying to dodge them. The lessons you learnt on the link won't help you evade a gremlin, though you boost and you dive and you jink. White ones will think. White ones wiggle your wingtips, male ones muddle your maps, green ones guzzle your glycol, and females will flutter your flaps. Pink ones will perch on your perspex and dance pirouettes on your prop. There's a spherical middle-aged gremlin who spins on your stick like a top."
That's hilarious.
So, I mean, yeah.
I love that.
It's a good example of, obviously, the sort of... cultural sort of side of it, the morale boosting side of it.
Did you get to the end part here where it says, "Told by PRU, pretty ruddy, unlikely to many, but fact nonetheless to the few." Yeah. I love that. That's really cool.
So this is obviously a poem discounting the gremlins because they feel like it's a...
not really.
Well, I mean, it
says pretty unlikely to many, but it is a fact to the few that have experienced it.
Right.
So that to me... that's not discounting it.
I guess not.
That's just, that's acknowledging. That's a really fun poem. Do you know who wrote that?
It's not titled here. It doesn't say. I wonder if it was the same guy. If it was... You mean
the...
Dahl.
Griffith? Oh, Dahl. Perhaps. Possibly. That would definitely
be... Makes sense, because it would have been the same...
That's in his wheelhouse.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But anyway, it's kind of it's a funny poem, but it's, it speaks to, I just thought that was interesting. There's so many different types of gremlins.
That is cool.
Right? But they're all basically the same, they're doing the same thing. Except for the ice gremlins.
The ice gremlin. What does that even mean? Actually, that makes sense to me. If these ice gremlins are operating at over 10,000 feet, then maybe that simply means that is a really cold area and there's freezing happening on the plane.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because that was very subtle, or not subtle, sorry, it was just very vague, the account of that. But it makes sense if it's that high.
It does. So I guess we're getting into our theories section here.
Theories. It's time for some theories.
Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, because I think we're going to start, obviously, with the sort of skeptical perspective and the fact that the gremlins might be a result of simple hallucinations that may or may not have been drug-induced.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is definitely a very large history of the use of amphetamines, speed, used by pilots, and not just pilots, it was used everywhere in the military. And it has a very rich history in America. So the exact name is benzedrine, and it was first developed in the 20s into the 30s by Smith, Kline, and French. And it was initially sort of marketed as a nasal and bronchial decongestant, very quickly gained a reputation as pep pills, wakey pills, or go pills, because it was a very lively amphetamine. And it definitely was a stimulant, heightened good mood, energy, was used by students, doctors, everyone, even housewives in the 20s up to the 50s, and even beyond that, really. So it's very interesting, yeah. Obviously, pre-war, this was happening. So, again, this could play into the Charles Lindbergh account. I couldn't come up with any actual direct correlation between him and benzedrine. Okay. But you would think
possibly was using it.
If they're using it to keep themselves awake and keep, you know what I mean?
Like 33-hour flight.
Right? Yeah, that just seems common sense almost.
Yeah.
It's not like he's going to bring, like, a coffee machine with him or something.
Yeah.
But, yeah. It actually was, it was used in the war by the Allies, by the British. There's archives that contain records of British instructions on the use of benzedrine in war operations. It recommended that soldiers ingest 5 to 10 milligrams of benzedrine sulfate every 5 to 6 hours, not exceeding 20 milligrams per day, issued at the discretion of the unit's medical officer when sleep was severely limited for several days. So, doesn't that again remind you of that X-Files episode, right? With the Vietnam soldiers that were experimented on, and they were basically...
Fourth reference.
Fourth reference. Boom. Where they were basically deprived of all sleep, and their brains weren't able to turn off. So this is kind of like the chemical version of this.
Yeah.
So it definitely had very positive effects for alertness, and it had euphoric effects. It's actually the base of the street drug ecstasy these days.
Crazy.
Yes, but there is definitely notable changes in mood that can definitely lead to some irresponsibility, garrulousness, etc.
Okay.
So, yeah, it could definitely have some negative side effects. And people did have psychotic episodes, even at prescribed doses. So, and this is actually well documented with the rise of ADD. Apparently that was used to as a prescription for people, and they definitely, a lot of children had severe psychological and neurological effects that did lead to psychosis in some cases.
Okay.
So this could maybe lend itself to some hallucinogenic properties, especially if you are in tight quarters, alone, flying in a plane at high altitudes. So, yeah, I'm not really going to get too into this, but there was this one instance when they were doing testing, and this was with the Royal Air Force. Roland Winfield, he was studying these effects of benzedrine on long-range bomber command missions, and he observed a bomber pilot suddenly plunge his aircraft below the cover of clouds into heavy anti-aircraft fire in order to, quote, press home the attack. And it says here, the pilot scored a direct hit. And after this, Winfield, he recommended benzedrine for every RAF mission for determination and aggression. And by early 1942, Smith, Kline, and French were supplying large amounts of benzedrine to the RAF.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and on the flip side of this, you do get the same sort of rise of amphetamine use in German military.
Right.
But by about this time, by 42, they had actually dropped off. They realized that it had
some negative
highly
effects.
Addictive properties, and that exactly that.
Like for their pilots, anyway.
For everyone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, when they were doing their blitzkriegs, when they were doing when they were doing their stormtrooper offensives, that type of thing.
Crazy.
They were all on benzedrine.
Right.
Or not benzedrine, but it was a different sort of amphetamine that was very similar.
Yeah. Huh.
And so this is interesting here. This is a quote from Laurier Military History Archives.com. It says here, estimated allied consumption of amphetamines during the Second World War ranged from $870 million. Or no, is that
870,000?
770,000. Sorry. In sales of benzedrine sulfate in 1943 to a staggering 72 million tablets supplied to Great Britain throughout the war.
Crazy.
Although the Allies had enthusiastically adopted stimulants, the Germans had largely abandoned methamphetamine by 1941, with German officials reclassifying Pervitin, that was the one that they were using, as a highly dangerous, addictive narcotic.
So the Allies kept using it, the Germans stopped using it.
Yeah. And you know what's actually interesting? The reason that the Allies were so gung-ho on this is because they had heard about the Germans using it in their offensive. They're like, oh, shoot, like, we should be using that too, baby. Yeah. And so that's kind of
I remember learning that for, like, the First World War too, right? For that whole, the Schlieffen Plan or whatever, like, when they had to march so far, weren't they, like, on something then too? Because they could just march day and night.
Were, yeah, like, exactly, right? Yeah. All the early offensives, they would have been on it.
Right.
And it's interesting, like, people might know this in pop culture as the bennies. I'm not sure. Like, that's definitely, it's dropped off. Like, I was looking at several sources. Public consciousness of this drug has definitely declined from the 70s onward. Like, basically not even talked about these days. But if you are from the older generation, you probably would know it.
Right.
And it actually, if you are a James Bond fan, in the series of books by Ian Fleming, the character repeatedly makes use of Benzedrine in times of peak stress and typically during the climax of the book. So in the first book, Casino Royale, written in 1953, Soviet agent Le Chiffre is noted to make use of Benzedrine, an inhaler, as he plays Baccarat. I don't even know what that is. Okay. And then the character James Bond's first use of Benzedrine was in the form of tablets in the book Live and Let Die. Crazy. This is a quote from the book. It says, "He still felt perfectly fresh, and the elation and clarity of mind produced by the Benzedrine was still with him." End quote. So, yeah, I don't know. Man. Can people be on Benzedrine and be hallucinating that they're seeing gremlins? The thing that you can poke several holes in this theory, right? Because this was used in all areas of the military. It wasn't just in the air.
Right.
And then also the fact that this was used in the 20s, in the 30s. It was used by everyone. It was used by novelists, poets, doctors, lawyers.
And these people aren't
seeing gremlins,
no.
man.
The only difference, obviously, is the fact that pilots are in high stress situations. Yeah. They're at high altitudes. They're at different varying temperatures, isolated. Yeah. All those things matter, but it does also matter to know, that people were taking the exact same thing. You'd think that there would be,
and they were taken into the 50s, too, and all that.
Right, so it's like on a scale of 0 to 10, it's like, okay, 10's going to be pilots experiencing crazy stuff because they're in high-stress situations, but it's like people who are just on the ground, you'd think they'd be in a 1 or a 2. Like, there's still, if you're overusing the drug, you'd experience something.
It affected everyone differently, and those people that kind of had more nervous or anxious dispositions definitely experienced the negative effects more rapidly. Right. And it depended how long you were on this stuff, too. So maybe if pilots were using it all the time, but in all accounts, it seems as if everyone in America was using this all the time. It was like pet pills were just the thing to do. Like, literally, people were popping bennies with their morning coffee, and that's how they would go about their day. Mm-hmm. There's so many, like, there's a couple, I can't think of the names on the top of my head, some famous novelists he basically was so hard on himself for this chemical dependency is what he called it. But he continued on because he didn't know any other way to stay creative.
Right.
But these days, we don't have that. And I'm kind of like thinking to myself, like, Dubs TF, man. if we had that when we were doing this research, like, I'd be up all night.
Yeah, well, never mind. I mean, when we were in university, like, we knew tons of people who were taking Adderall.
Oh, right. Maybe that's the current.
It's like the super, like,
That is probably what bennies are today. That's probably the exact same chemical
Similar,
base.
Probably, right? Yeah.
Just like a newer version.
To help focus, right? I've never tried.
I'm curious now. We should look into that.
Yeah.
Because, that was terrible. I remember I took those, like...
Really? I never tried.
And it was weird because my doctor thought that I was having anxiety because I was too stressed about school. So he prescribed me those so that I would do more work and not be as stressed. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't go to sleep. So
that doesn't make it.
No, it was very backwards.
It's a little backwards.
Honestly, I don't like that doctor.
The one thing about this whole Benzedrine thing and, like, the idea of hallucinations, to me, that... Like, we've already referenced the one thing that's like, okay, multiple people are seeing similar things. That's interesting. That kind of gives legitimacy to it, even if multiple people are using the same drug. Yeah. You're not going to have the exact same hallucination, right?
No.
So, but that's the other thing too. The hallucinations if they are hallucinations, are extremely vivid. Like,
and have physical manifestations.
Exactly.
Too.
Like, I can't think of any times that I've hallucinated off the top of my head, but, like, I can picture it being that, like, if you are hallucinating something, if you're using a Benzedrine or whatever, it's going to be kind of a floating, fleeting thing, right? Like, oh, you're going to see something, but then it's not there. You're hallucinating. It's like it's there, but then it isn't, right? It's not like it's, oh my God, there's a thing perched on the front of my plane, banging on the window of my plane, and then another one over here, and it's like really vivid.
And one sucking out the...
Like, that is the best acid that you've ever taken in your life kind of hallucination. Not like, oh, I'm a little bit out of it because I'm cold and I've taken too much Benzedrine kind of hallucination.
Yeah.
That's like full-blown, like... That's salvia hallucination.
No kidding, yeah. And the fact that this was, again, so widely documented and has these sorts of things, like where there's substances like, say, sand found, where sand should never be. And it's not like... That's
not a hallucination.
Like, is your entire unit hallucinating the exact same... You know what I mean?
Right.
Is this a mass hallucination?
Yeah, it's just very inconsistent.
Stella.
Oh my gosh, our dog is snoring so loud.
Got a snoring bulldog. We love her, though.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings me to our second sort of more skeptical theory, and that's the idea that it could have been gas fumes.
Right.
And this was particular to the Lindbergh account. I actually came across this in the 14 Times, one of their forums, actually. And it was an anonymous contribution, but I'll read it out anyway.
Okay.
He says here, the Spirit of St. Louis has a strange design feature. The main fuel tank was placed directly in front of Lindbergh because he didn't want to be caught between it and the engine if he had to have a forced landing. It normally would have been placed behind his seat. My point is that the fumes from the tank might have had a hallucinogenic effect. Coupled with a lack of sleep and boredom, he couldn't see out of the plane and had to use a periscope. Not that he would have seen much anyway. He must have sent his head into a spin. And that's the end of the quote. Huh. But that's... What? Okay, wait a second. That he couldn't see out of the plane and had to use a periscope? You couldn't see where you're going?
I actually saw like a sketch of the cockpit of Lindbergh's plane, and it was just bizarre. It's like, I think there's glass on the side, but like when you're looking forward, it's just the mechanics.
What? How would you feel comfortable with that? That's crazy.
How would you feel comfortable at all flying a plane across the Atlantic for 33
hours? You're literally
hours?
flying a box blind across the ocean.
Yeah, that's what those things looked like, right? Like even when we watched the one of the Amelia Earhart movies, and we were researching for that episode when she did her transatlantic flight, it's literally like a soapbox car with wings, is what it looks like. It's like crazy the amount of guts that would take for Lindbergh and for it's insane.
Couldn't pay me to do that, that's for sure.
No thanks.
No.
But that's an interesting theory. Obviously placement of the gas tank would matter. I don't know.
Sorry, that's a big stretch.
That's okay.
Honestly, though, there was another reply to this anonymous contribution on the 14 Times forum, and I thought that this, again, was a good reply. So it says here, quote, putting the fuel tank ahead of the pilot isn't all that unusual in terms of aircraft design. Other options include putting the pilot's seat on top or in front of the tank. Also, aviation fuel is not a hallucinogen. And even if Lindbergh had smelt any fumes from it, it would have been enough for him to abandon his flight. Leaking fuel and fires are, after all, one of the worst hazards that can beset an aircraft. End quote. That was from Jerry_B. But that's a good point too. So, I'm
not really buying that theory.
Can you hallucinate from, you can get lightheaded? You would think that...
It's not directly hallucinating from that. It's circumstantial. So it's like if you're huffing gas
from a lack of oxygen because you're ingesting this gas?
Yeah. And at altitude and at temperature and whatever.
I don't really buy it either, but it is definitely something that could... And the thing is, too, this plane design, was this replicated in RAF pilots and you say U.S. aircraft pilots? I don't believe so. No. Again, I have to do a little more research on that one.
Yeah, well... I'm not buying it anyway, so phase it.
Phase it. It's phased.
Honestly, we don't really have too many other theories.
The main one is we've kind of been alluding to the whole time that these are kind of like spirits or
that they're metaphysical creatures.
Yeah.
That they are only that these pilots were passing through areas where they just happened to be. I mean, it's like any cryptid creature. That's kind of the... metaphysical and cryptid creature are two different things, obviously. Mm-hmm. But it's we've talked about creatures that kind of fall somewhere in between. Our last week's episode, the bunyip, was one of those kind of creatures. Yeah. It's sort of this spiritual, almost metaphysical kind of creature that appears sometimes it doesn't. Ogopogo, kind of the same thing. these gremlins aren't tied to like indigenous folklore or anything like that, unless you reach all the way back to ancient China.
But you do get interpretations of like fairies and things that have similar nefarious sort of, where they'll hide things, or they'll like your car keys will be where they're not supposed to be, or something.
No, for sure. I guess my point is that like with like the bunyips and those types of things, it's like it's a metaphysical creature, but it has a very distinct habitat. It's almost like you look at it as if you're looking for a cryptid creature, not a metaphysical creature, right?
Yeah, on that note,
no, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, they don't have wings. There's no wings described in any of these accounts, so it's like, where did the frick did these come from?
That is a very good point that I don't think we've made.
Yeah.
These things are flying up there, harassing airplanes, and they do not have wings. That is absolutely bizarre.
They've got, like, superhuman grip.
It's like...
how are they hanging onto these planes while they're flying around?
Yeah, it's...
Either that, like, it almost reminds me of, like, a cryptid version of electronic fog.
Yeah, almost, right? Like, you're going through a patch of something, and it just happens to be these things living there.
Another question, too, is, like, what about commercial and passenger, like, just non-war related commercial flights at this exact time, private flights, like pilots that are just flying their own little plane, like Amelia Earhart would have been doing, that type of thing.
There have been almost no instances of gremlins since the 1940s.
But obviously there was commercial flights happening during the war. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So, we've never come across
probably not in the same areas, obviously.
So you're saying that maybe gremlins have a specific airspace?
I'm thinking that... no, I'm saying that like anything... whenever we talk about interdimensional or metaphysical entities and stuff like that, there's specific locations where it can happen. Ogopogo is only going to be seen in Okanagan Lake.
But these aren't specific to one location.
Well, you could argue they are. I mean, the battles that are happening in the air are taking place in sort of, specific theaters.
What about the one that took place in, what was it, not Los Angeles Air Base going to Honolulu, that one where it was like a little more deadly?
If you believe that to be gremlins.
And then we get accounts from Britain, we get accounts from the Kremlin over in Russia.
That's true, very true.
I think it's a lot more widespread.
Yeah. I guess I'm just saying that it's not the same as, like, Sasquatch. There's a hairy man in Pakistan, there's a Sasquatch in Canada, there's a Bigfoot in California, there's this over there, right?
Yeah, there's a big difference between having that one creature and having a bunch of creatures.
Yeah, that's the other part of it too.
Yeah.
That's honestly, I feel like the hive mentality of it as how they're described, and the fact that there's swarms of them kind of, I don't know, like, it doesn't legitimize the theory of interdimensionality by any means, but it makes me think that it makes kind of more sense that these are creatures that when you cross through their space, they'll come out and mess with you. Yeah. So I don't think they live in the sky, but if they are real, obviously that's
their space, man.
That's their space.
And that kind of, the idea that this interdimensionality, that I feel particularly applies to the Lindenberg case, because, like, he could have transcended into another dimension. And, like, the idea that one description where it sounded like he opened up his third eye. It was kind of what it sounded like, right? Where he didn't have to turn around. He was, like, literally, he could see in all directions at the same time.
Right.
Like, that to me is very...
It's basically the idea of, like that these things and, like, that type of experience is happening right now all the time around us. It's just whether or not we can perceive it or not.
Yeah.
So it's like...
Exactly.
And the creatures of that world, right?
Totally. And even that guy, Hubert, like, he was saying, like, I never known of this whole different side of reality, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Where these creatures exist in this plane where the large majority of people are not conscious of them. And the way that sort of reads to me is it's very similar to a lot of paranormal phenomena, right?
Yeah.
The existence of ghosts, for example, or spirits, or like even the one episode we did just recently on the lake, the Invisible City, Kitesh, and like the spirits from there, and how like many people, only the most pious will see them.
You know what I mean? They'll hear it.
Yeah. So maybe you need to gain some sort of spiritual enlightenment to a certain, or be stressed to such an extent, like in the case of these pilots in the RAF and wherever else in World War II, that the limits of their consciously functioning brains are altered to an extent where things like this are happening.
They can see that now. Yeah.
Did that sound smart? I don't even know.
I think so.
I want to know what all you listeners think.
Yeah,
we're gonna be doing a poll this week for this
absolutely,
episode.
because
so check it out on our social medias. Like we'll do one on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Twitter's
yeah,
a good place
we'll put
for
it
that.
out there for sure.
Yeah,
I definitely don't like just to tie this in because just to quickly go back to that 1939 incident with the 12 dead crewmen. I don't think that was Gremlins.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like, having gone through this, that's like the same thing, unless that was the super, super nefarious species of gremlin that never got referenced anywhere else.
Or maybe there was just like, they were like trying to pull this funny prank like they always do, and then it just goes horribly wrong.
Yeah.
They're like,
ooh. Maybe we'll disappear for another couple hundred years, after the 40s, I guess. Yeah. But it does kind of tie in a little bit, I guess, to the Kelly Hopkinsville.
Right.
Where it was like, those were goblins, similar to the Gremlins, but floating, walking this line between, is this a UFO incident or a cryptid creature incident? So, but at the end of the day, I don't think Gremlins are killers? Reconnaissance things coming from a UFO. I don't think they're aliens. I don't think they're killers. I think if they are real killers. I think if they are a real thing, it's like one of those it's they're a metaphysical entity that can only be seen at certain times. You're not going to catch me flying any retro vintage 1940s Spitfires anytime soon.
Yeah, try getting me into just like even a modern plane. That's a hassle. I don't like that. I don't like being in the air.
Yeah.
I don't like. I just don't.
And now when we fly, you'll be looking out the window trying to. There's something on the wing. Something.
I love that line. Ace Ventura, you rock. Oh,
well, I guess that kind of wraps her up, folks.
It basically does, yeah. I was stoked on this episode. This was a fun one.
It was just fun. It was kind of like. It ended up being a little more lighthearted than I thought it would be. Mm-hmm. But because there's nobody dies. Like, nobody gets, other than the 12 crewmen on that one incident in 1939. Yeah. But in terms of the Gremlin stories, it's just
a fun story. Fun. It's folklore. That's what we're all about.
Totally.
We like to cover the history. So obviously the World War II was really fun just for us to dive back into. Yeah. And we got a really fun one coming up next week too. Hey, should we give a little teaser for that?
Sure.
It has something to do with AC and DC currents. Yeah. And we're not going to get super sciencey, but we're going to do a little bit of an expose, the myths behind the man. Yeah. And that will be with a Dash of Science host, Chris. Yep. And we're going to be talking about Tesla. Yeah. So, super excited about that. It's going to be fun. Definitely. But as usual, please reach out to us on our social medias. We've had some really fun responses this last week. Yeah, we've been chatting back and forth with a few people on via email, which has been so much fun. Yeah. So on the socials as well. Yeah. Twitter has been really active. We've had lots of great feedback from that Bunyip episode. Hey? Yeah, more feedback than any other episode in the past, honestly, I think. It's up there for sure. Yeah. So you can reach out to us at intotheportalmailbox@gmail.com anytime. We love emailing back and forth with people on there. Our Twitter handle is at intotheportal1, the number 1, and Amber's on there at AmberRain1992. And come follow us on Instagram as well, at IntoThePortalPodcast on Instagram. Definitely. And we're always posting stuff about the shows. We are. And then, of course, there's the Facebook group too. We have a forum, which definitely, join us. So we love to have little conversations and just bring in interesting articles relevant, to whatever. It doesn't have to be specific to the episode. It's just whatever we find interesting or you guys find interesting, want to bring to the table. We just love talking to you guys. We just love interacting, and it's just super fun. So come chat with us. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and until next time. On Into the Portal.
was a podcast from the Podfix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.